Jim, this question for the late night drive-thru comes from Steve in Toledo.
Holy Toledo!
While I wholeheartedly agree with Jim's thoughts on how phony video game wrestling is killing the industry, I was curious as to your thoughts on how MMA has affected the wrestling industry. Now that UFC has become so mainstream, it seems like simulating a realistic-looking fight and asking the audience to suspend disbelief is harder than it has ever been.
And I think there's something to that. And but at the same point, wrestling and boxing coexisted for decades and decades and decades, and two guys standing and trading in a boxing match doesn't look anything like two guys standing and doing a 1-2, 1-2 in a wrestling match, but it still worked. They still coexisted. Wrestling always, once before we started just telling everybody everything, they made the point that wrestling is different rules than boxing or different rules than karate or whatever. That's why it looks different, and guys are allowed to do different things or whatever the fuck. It would be harder today, yes, but still, I watch guys who, when they know how to work and they know what to do but don't do too much but still do enough to keep people's attention, and the shit looks good and it looks like it hurts, they get people involved and they get people hooked in it. And, and those people may or may not have seen the UFC, but it's still possible. But when you watch a big money UFC main event and see the people reacting and see the excitement and see the guys banging each other, and then you watch, some of this hocus pocus bullshit where they break out in a dance routine, of course, it's going to be that much harder. I think a lot of modern MMA fighters would love to watch some old Billy Robinson and fucking Tony Charles just to get some pointers. It was just as worked as the shit today. They just didn't let on and they made it look better.
Do you think there's a place for a worked MMA? The way that, wrestling was wrestling and then it became pro wrestling. Is there a place for a worked mixed martial arts promotion? Because, it's easy to do those submissions. It's easy to feign a lot of those things that make MMA so great. Is there something for a pro wrestling version of MMA?
Yeah, well, there's a place for a worked MMA promotion, just not if anybody knows about it. And it probably already has been. And they didn't know about. That's the beauty of it. Yes, just like there was room for plenty of wrestling promotions before we came out and just admitted everything, there would definitely be room for a worked, a manipulated, not just a flat out scripted and homogenized and sanitized like sports entertainment bullshit, but for a worked and manipulated MMA group where you didn't know which was which and there was some of both. It's probably already happening, but there's definitely room for it.
To this question of how MMA has affected the wrestling industry, I think one of the things that's most striking is in many ways how it hasn't affected it as much as it should have. What lessons do you think, let's just use the WWE as the example because they're the biggest. What could the WWE learn from the presentation and from the organization of the UFC?
Well, I've always said, or not always, but I've said recently the UFC is the most successful pro wrestling promotion in the world. What they do that wrestling used to do is they build grudges. They build realistic grudges and they hype their fighters with their stories of their background and their training in the same way, because the reason why all that was done originally in wrestling was because to make it look as real as possible, would you have a training camp? Would you have this blah, blah, blah? Whatever you do in a real sport was done in wrestling, to the point where they kind of became some cliche stuff sometimes, the big contract signing or whatever. But, that's why it was done in wrestling to begin with, because it would have been done if it was a shoot. And, with the difference in MMA now, I think is lessened the impact that it had. If all of a sudden in 1982, the UFC had come along and we went from a really good segment of the wrestling fan population at least believes there's something real about what we're doing, and all of a sudden they watch UFC and they went that culture shock, it would probably kill the wrestling business dead. As it was, there was 20 years or whatever of conditioning everybody that, well, yeah, wrestling is all fake. You may have suspected it. Now we're telling you it's true, and here's why, and here's how it's done. They had that conditioning, and then they see the UFC get big at the same time, and they go, okay, yeah. But it wasn't a big shock. If the UFC had come along 30 years earlier, it had killed wrestling deader than 4 o'clock because everybody would have been hot and pissed all at the same time that they'd been hoodwinked. Just in my opinion.
And if you look back at the classic days of wrestling, which wrestling promoters do you think would have succeeded as MMA promoters?
Well, definitely Watts. He would have loved that kind of shit if he'd been young enough to either get into it or get into the promotion of it when he was still young and feisty and could put the same amount of energy toward that as he did wrestling. I think Eddie Graham would have been great at it. Probably Old Man Funk, Dory Funk Sr., because, the guys that were Vern Gagne, for fuck's sake, he was an NCAA heavyweight champion. He held Brock's belt in 1948. Those guys would have all been wonderful because promoting wrestling was kind of like promoting MMA back then. You brought in fighters, you exposed them to your local population, either by running their record up against underneath guys or putting them on television and letting them talk. And then the top guys, whether it be, your Conor McGregor or your goddamn Mad Dog Vachon, who was in the Olympics in 48, have grudges with each other that you bring to light and they settle them in the ring. It was promoting MMA. It was promoting fights. That was the way they did it. So any of those guys that already had a amateur background and excelled in dealing with real athletes and trying to maintain some level of realism in between all the juice and the blood and chains and the gimmicks, etc., they probably would have done just as well if MMA had been a thing then.